The 9 justices could elect to uphold parts of Pennsylvania's law and still leave the Roe v. Wade abortion principle in place, but it could also make new law. Anthony Collins reports.
The High Court agreed to review the Pennsylvania law after abortion rights activists urged it to say whether women still have a constitutional right to abortion. The Pennsylvania law imposes a 24-hour waiting period, requires a doctor to inform a woman about fetal development and abortion alternatives, and requires parental consent for minors to have abortions. Abortion rights advocates asked the court to strike down the law and say whether the court still adheres to its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion.
If the Supreme Court upholds the Pennsylvania law, it is overturning Roe v. Wade, because what it's saying is that abortion is no longer a fundamental right.
Anti-abortion groups trying to downplay the issue say the court could avoid making this an ultimate Roe case and simply uphold the Pennsylvania restrictions as not being unduly burdensome.
Those are reasonable provisions in the statute that the public supports that the pro-abortionists do not, and would like to see the public opposed by a reframing of the issue on their part.
Pennsylvania's Attorney General wants the court to restore an additional provision struck down by a lower court for a wife to notify her husband before having an abortion. A recent Gallup poll shows that 64% of Americans oppose overturning Roe. So do the major Democratic presidential candidates. President Bush favors overturning Roe. According to some analysts, his re-election bid could be hurt if the court does so.
If that happened, I think there would be an explosive reaction among pro-choice voters, which includes a lot of Republicans, Republican women, well-educated voters. Abortion is the issue that can tear the Republican coalition apart.
The court is expected to hear oral arguments this spring and rule by July.
Abortion rights advocates want the court to end the uncertainty over Roe, but there's no guarantee the justices will see this as a Roe case. How they do see it could become clearer by the questions they ask at the oral arguments. Anthony Collins, CNN, at the Supreme Court.
And those arguments are set for April. Whatever the court decides, this will certainly be a closely watched matter. And people on both sides of the issue have a feeling they know what's going to happen.
We've had Souter and Clarence Thomas added to the court. So, I'm sorry, I just don't see any history left for Roe versus Wade. They're going to vote to for sure uphold all of the PA legislation and probably vote to overturn Roe versus Wade.
We know what this court is going to do, and now we know when this court is going to do it. No matter how the court shapes its decision, if it tears at Roe one more time, the Bush legacy will be the destruction of our fundamental right to choose, and America will soon be an infinitely more dangerous place for American women.
At least 2 of the 24 Washington area clinics were the scene of protests today. More than 270 anti-abortion advocates were arrested and taken away on buses. Abortion rights activists tried to form a protective line around a clinic, but some of the anti-abortionists were able to get through. Both sides plan rallies in the nation's capital tomorrow. Japan is doing some damage control over remarks attributed to the country's House Speaker. He was quoted as saying American workers are lazy, and 1/3 of them can't understand written instructions because they're illiterate. Now Japan's foreign minister says his country is sorry for the remarks. He claims the Tokyo government doesn't share that view at all, but some U.S. lawmakers are still outraged.
I think the comments of the Japanese Speaker of the House show an attitude in terms of a slander on American workers. And I think that is the same view that Japan held the day that its warplanes struck Pearl Harbor. That arrogance was gone by 1945 when they learned the full measure of America's capabilities.
In Washington today, officials from the National Alliance of Business, the AFL-CIO, and Motorola talked about how competitive the U.S. workforce really is. The president of the Business Alliance says American workers are as good or better than any in the world. The South Korean government will seek compensation from Japan for women forced to be prostitutes during World War II. Today's decision was prompted by revelations that thousands of Koreans were forced to become comfort women for Japanese soldiers. The Japanese government has apologized and concedes some kind of compensation ought to be paid. A truce was reported in the Republic of Georgia. The Reuters news agency reports forces loyal to ousted President Zviad Gamshakurdia have reached a ceasefire accord with government troops. Fighting has raged for weeks in the former Soviet Republic. Gamshakurdia was elected to the presidency, but the provisional government accuses him of being a dictator. The UN Security Council has unanimously approved a resolution calling for Libya to surrender 2 intelligence agents accused in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. It also wants Tripoli to cooperate in the investigation of the 1989 bombing of a French jetliner. The country's industry minister told the council earlier today the charges are baseless. Libya has refused to turn over the men, but it has agreed they could stand trial in Libya. 270 people perished when the Pan Am jet blew up over Scotland in 1988. Some families of the victims say the UN resolution is weak, but better than nothing. Rescue workers have found the 2 flight recorders from the French Airbus that crashed last night near Strasbourg. Both are damaged, but it's hoped they will still provide clues. 87 people are believed to have died in the crash. 9 others survived. Peter Hume has more.
For the handful of survivors, it was a harrowing ordeal. After crawling dazed and shocked from the wreckage, some of them badly injured, there was to be a 4-hour wait before rescuers arrived on the scene on a remote and heavily wooded mountainside about 30 miles southeast of Strasbourg. Snow, fog and freezing conditions delayed the rescue parties and added to the survivors' hardships. Those who lived spoke of 10 to 15 seconds of sheer terror as the plane preparing to land skimmed through treetops before hitting the ground and exploding. Most of the survivors, including a 9-year-old boy and a 13-month-old baby girl, were seated towards the rear of the plane. The most severely injured were first cared for by other survivors. One spoke of putting the injured close to burning wreckage in an effort to keep them warm in the freezing conditions. More than 1,000 medics, police and army personnel were deployed in the search, which was launched soon after the plane on an internal flight from Lyon disappeared off the radar screens. The few survivors received basic treatment at the crash site before being taken to hospitals in cities nearby. Relatives and friends had waited for information at Strasbourg Airport. For most, the news would be tragic. A full-scale inquiry has been launched into Monday night's disaster, and French Prime Minister Edith Cresson is cutting short a visit to Italy to visit survivors in Strasbourg. The plane, an Airbus 320, is one of the most modern now flying. Only in service since 1988, its onboard computer systems are uniquely capable of operating all the plane's controls. In theory, it flies itself. However, its reliability has been in question. The spectacular crash almost at its debut during an air show in France 3.5 years ago, and a crash of an Air India Airbus in 1990 between them claimed nearly 100 lives. Both those incidents were put down to pilot error. Peter Hume, CNN, Paris.
Cuban exiles in Miami vented their anger at President Fidel Castro last night. His government executed a fellow exile convicted of leading a commando group to stage terrorist strikes in Cuba. Eduardo Diaz Betancourt and 2 other Miami residents were arrested 3 weeks ago. The Cuban news agency says they arrived on a beach with explosives. The 2 other men had their death sentences commuted to 30 years in prison. President Bush says more children need Head Starts, and he wants to make sure they get them. Visiting a Head Start center in Maryland today, he proposed $600 million in increased funding for the program. Democrats want an even bigger increase, $1 billion. The 27-year-old Head Start program provides preschool education for low-income children. Despite his efforts to build public support, President Bush's standing in the polls continues to falter. A CBS News poll found only 45% of those surveyed approve of his performance. It also shows for the first time the president would lose to an unnamed Democrat in the fall. If the election were held today, 43% said they would go with the Democrat, and 38% would re-elect Mr. Bush. You might think cattle rustling is a part of the Old West, but Don Knapp reports the tough economy is bringing the crime to modern times.
A few kind words, a handful of hay, and she'll follow you anywhere. Bossy's an easy target for would-be rustlers. Bovine thefts on the rise in Sonoma County, California. Rancher Shirley O'Connor has lost 2 calves to rustlers since September.
There's many people stealing horses now because horses are bringing quite a bit of money, and there people are stealing goats around the county that many times go unreported, and they're going on somebody's dinner table.
Sometimes the thieves take the whole animal. Other times, just the steaks, roasts, and hamburger.
The animals usually are gutted on the spot, and then some of the hindquarters or forequarters may be removed, if not the entire carcass. Basically, what's left over is hoofs and a head.
Deputy Rick Kraut says a ranch hand or experienced meat cutter can get the animal's best in under 4 minutes. Or it could take as long as an hour for a clumsy thief to do a roadside butcher job.
Some ranchers think stealing animals is a recession-driven crime.
An easy way for desperate people to get money, or at least put meat on the table. Some blame the recession for a competition for road-killed animals in Montana. The state has traditionally donated traffic-killed deer, elk, and moose to the needy. But one food bank director says roadkill